your questions until after the speakers are done up here, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. We'll start with Mayor Ted Wheeler.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being with me here today. I want to start by extending my condolences to the family of George Floyd and to his many friends and supporters. I know this is a difficult day and that his memorial service has just wrapped up in recent moments, so I want them to know that my thoughts are with them. I'm committed to doing everything I can to disrupt the patterns of injustice. And I'm committed to listening to our Black leaders about the reforms that they're seeking both now and in the long term, and to act immediately and aggressively to interrupt systems of institutional racism and injustice. Earlier this week, I talked with my team about the need to act with urgency, and I asked them to think about the right first step. Yesterday, they proposed an action. We talked it through, we agreed on an approach, and we began to put that plan in motion. Last night, I shared my decision with Police Chief Jamie Resch and members of her command staff. This morning, I addressed our team of school resource officers in person. And this morning, I've learned that other community leaders have also arrived at the same conclusion about the change that's needed. It is needed, and the time to act is right now. I'm removing school resource officers, otherwise known as SROs, from all of our schools in our districts here in the city of Portland. That begins with eliminating the Portland Police Bureau's Youth Services Division and reassigning those officers to other duties, including patrol. Next, we're going to invest in the community so that they can decide how to best support our kids. I'll be redirecting $1 million a year from the Portland Police Bureau budget to a community-driven process. The community will get to decide and prioritize how that money will be used to support and nurture a more positive educational experience for Black children. More details will be forthcoming on that soon. I know these are big changes, and I want to make this clear. This is not a comment on the officers who've been doing this work in our schools. I know that many of these officers have built powerful, meaningful, and important relationships with both students and community members, and I thank them for that. I've previously supported this program based on the increasing training they've received over the years on restorative justice and cultural competency, and the new emphasis on mentoring rather than enforcement. But this, right now, is about the community telling us what they need. That's what's important right now, and we need to listen and act. Commissioner Hardesty, in particular, has advocated long for this reform, and I'm thankful for her leadership on restorative justice. Knowing her view on this matter, I was happy to be able to inform her of my decision yesterday evening. I'm pleased to take this action with the support of our largest school district and others who are calling for this change. Portland, we made another important commitment too. Yesterday afternoon, I proudly signed the pledge that former President Obama challenged every mayor in this nation to make. I joined with the mayors of San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, and many others on this important pledge for reform. The pledge is simple: review the Portland Police Bureau's use of force, engage the community, report out on our results, and make meaningful reform as a result. In the days and weeks to come, I'll share more about how the City of Portland will fulfill this commitment with the wisdom and the advice of our Black leaders. In closing, I want to talk about leadership. In a moment of reckoning that comes perhaps once in a generation, the President of the United States has abandoned the ideals of this nation. He's demanded that governors, quote, dominate, unquote, protesters who are fighting for racial justice. He's threatened to send in the military against peaceful demonstrators. He has allowed peaceful demonstrations outside of the White House to be sprayed with pepper spray and tear gas and hit with rubber bullets so that he can have his photo taken. Here's what our president hasn't done. Listen, learn, empathize, inspire. In cities across America, we're all feeling that void. And so yesterday, former President Obama addressed the nation. I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I also felt solidarity with my fellow mayors who recognize the gravity of this moment and who are joining me, rising up to meet it. President Obama reminded us that the United States of America was founded on protest, that our greatest progress comes when people hold the status quo up to the light of day and demand change. So, thank you, Portland, for demanding change. And together, we're going to deliver. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. We've sent Chief Resch home for some very much needed and well-deserved rest. Again last night, several thousand people gathered and marched peacefully in downtown Portland. The organizers of this effort managed the event very successfully and helped keep it peaceful. After the protesters left the area, some splinter groups remained that were less orderly. For the next several hours, people in this group of about 200 lit fires, threw projectiles at the police, and broke windows at a building. At one point, a security guard was assaulted with a bottle. Officers and paramedics arrived to assist him, and while they were leaving, one of our officers was struck in the face with a full beer can that someone threw at him. This brings the number of officers injured in the last week to 19. Officers arrested the driver of a pickup truck that had in an earlier incident, backed up towards them and endangered their safety. They found that person last night and took him into custody. Officers were able to arrest at least one other person who had been involved in several crimes over the past 3 days. We are noticing that vehicles and crowds are a particular hazard, and we are doing everything that we appropriately can to safely stop them and, when possible, arrest occupants who've been engaged in criminal activity. This crowd finally dispersed at about 4 a.m., and we were able to get through the night without being required to use tear gas. We recognize the need right now for people to come into the public space and make themselves heard. As a career public safety professional, I want you to know that I hear you. I've heard you in the past. We have a lot of work to do, and I have a lot of work to do to achieve our vision of a police bureau that our community trusts and can be proud of, and that is also a great place to work. We need your help to get there. I would ask for your help for Chief Resch and I and our team in making our vision a reality. Let's work together to finally realize the promise of equal justice under law for everyone. Before I wrap up, I want to take a minute to thank two different and specific groups of people. First, I would like to thank the thousands of people who've come out to make their voices heard over the last week. I know you're frustrated. I know you're angry. I know you're tired. But despite all this, you've been able to keep it peaceful and dignified, and I have a lot of respect for that. The actions of a small group of disruptors intent on committing criminal acts is no reflection on any of you. I'd also like to thank the families, husbands, wives, partners, parents, kids, neighbors, of our first responders in the police and fire bureaus. They get overlooked a lot in times like this. They're worried about their loved ones' physical safety and their mental and emotional well-being right now. They see what's going on, and it impacts them significantly. I want all of you to know that I have not forgotten about you. We have not forgotten about you. and I assure you that we're doing the best that we can to keep your loved ones, our officers, firefighters, and the administrative professionals who support them safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Davis. We're now going to open up the floor for questions. We have a microphone in back for the reporters that are in-house. We ask that you go there so the people viewing online can hear your questions if you have questions to ask. I have a number of them emailed and texted in as well, so we're going to be answering or asking those questions and having our speakers answer those as well as we go along. I'll be asking those from the microphone in back. Let's begin with Mayor Wheeler, though, and all the questions for Mayor Wheeler right now while he's up here, and then we'll move on to Deputy Chief Davis.
Hi, Mayor. Thanks for taking the time today. Talking about SROs being out of schools, what do you say to parents who maybe are concerned that if a situation like a school shooting or something were to happen, who's going to get there as quickly maybe as SROs in the past?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. And that, of course, has been one of the arguments I've put forth for maintaining the SRO division in the last 4 budgets that I put forth as mayor. But what we are hearing loudly and clearly from the community is that they do not want this direct, physical, ongoing presence in the schools. And while I came to this conclusion and moved my team forward to put this in place last night, you may be aware that the Portland Public Schools terminated the relationship a few minutes ago regardless. So it's a bit of a moot point. But what I would tell those parents is the safety of their children is paramount. And the Portland Police Bureau will figure out how to ensure to the best of their ability the safety of those children, working with the school districts to make sure that we do have strategies in place. And I want to second what Assistant Chief Davis said a moment ago. The people who work in the Portland Police Bureau, from the leadership team down to those who are out there every day on the streets, they are top-notch. They work really hard, they're resourceful, they're innovative, and they will adapt. And we're well aware of the threats that are confronting our children, and we will adapt to be able to address them as best as we can.
And another question for you in regards to budget. I know there's been a lot of conversations about cutting the budget for the Portland Police Bureau. Some conversations have been brought up about the body cams being cut, or at least that budget for it, whereas a lot of people believe that that is an accountability device that allows you to see firsthand what a situation is and how it got there. Are you looking at other ways to cut that budget instead? Is that a priority?
Oh, yeah. Look, everything has been on the table. Our budget, let me step back. I actually proposed that all of our bureaus, including our public safety bureaus, get a pass this year on any reductions. And we had engaged in really smart and thoughtful budget strategies in previous years that gave us room this year to have a zero-cut budget. That's what we'd planned for. Then the COVID crisis hit, and it knocked the bottom out of the economy and left us with a $75 million budget gap. So we've had to reevaluate everything. But the top line priority for me in this budget was preserve and protect frontline services for the community, including public safety and first response services, and retain as many of our employees as possible. And in working with our employees in partnership, we've been able to largely do that, including just yesterday, the City Council voted on 3 more labor agreements. We've now achieved about $14 million in voluntary savings through the leadership of our bargaining units. And of course, I directed a freeze on COLAs and merit pay. I myself discontinued my salary for the remainder of the calendar year. So all of our city employees are sacrificing in a way to help preserve resources for the community. With regard to the body camera program specifically, that is still in its infancy. It is in a pilot program. It would require us to put substantial new additional resources in this year to keep that pilot operational. And while it's not great, I did believe that if it came down to supporting frontline patrol services or alternatively maintaining that pilot program, I made a decision and was supported by my colleagues in ending the pilot program and using those resources to help close the budget gap and keep our frontline services operational.
And then just my final question. A lot of people have been talking about how this movement feels different from ones that we've seen in the past. Here in Portland, we've seen obviously protests over the years, but they keep saying that this one feels different and that they hope for citywide support. How do you plan going forward, not just in the next couple of days or as these protests continue, but how do you plan going forward over the next months and years as we work to make change to continue to support?
Yeah, well, what you're seeing is some combination of anger, frustration, fear, and anxiety about the pace of change on our nation's path towards true racial justice and equality. And nobody can deny that we have moved too slowly. And that's the frustration that you're seeing on the street. Obviously, the most recent impetus was the blatant and obvious murder of George Floyd. But that just highlighted the inequities and the disparity and the institutional racism and the ongoing injustice that has been under the surface all along. This is nothing new, and you hear that from our Black community. This is not new. This is simply such an egregious, in-your-face example of it that you can't avoid it. And so what this younger generation in particular, and not to discount the work of our community elders who've been engaged in the civil rights movement for many, many decades, but what the younger generation is saying is they have had enough. They are tired of mere conversations or platitudes or statements of values. They demand change. And so removing the school resource officers from the community is one of the things that they have demanded. And as people know, this is a shift in direction for me in terms of my belief in the school resource officer program. But we can no longer make any excuses for not listening to what the community wants. The community wants this, we are listening, and we're doing it.
Thank you.
Hi, Rebecca from OPB.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hey, does this impact SROs in other Portland districts?
Yes, it does. And Chief Davis, it's all three, which districts? Portland Public Schools, David Douglas, and Park Rose.
Got it.
I believe that. I just didn't want to give you false information by accident. Thank you.
Second question. This announcement comes after Hardesty's announcement in council yesterday to do away with SROs, gun violence reduction team, and the transit police. I'm wondering if this announcement has anything to do with that announcement and also where those other two asks stand.
Commissioner Hardesty has been very clear with me for several years that this is something she would like to see. She has not been bashful in her expression of her desires. This is a debate that you'll recall was very active a couple of years ago, and you'll recall that the Portland Public Schools had some heated hearings around the question of police in schools. This is also part of a larger national dialogue around police in schools, and there's been some really egregious examples of police officers around the country arresting little children or body slamming young kids. And what we did here in response to that was made sure that our school resource officers were, first of all, of the right demeanor, who liked working with kids, who wanted to work with kids and uplift and support them. They had additional training that regular officers don't get around working with kids, de-escalation strategies, restorative justice. And we moved away from enforcement as being an objective towards uplifting those kids and engaging them and helping them be supported in their educational efforts. That being said, the demand is coming through loudly and clearly, and it's not just from individuals. We're hearing it broadly. It's been a demand that's been on the table for the better part of a week from many demonstrators and others in the community, and we believe the time is right to do this.
Where do Commissioner Hardesty's other two asks from yesterday go in terms of?
So Commissioner Hardesty had asked that we review all of the specialty units. That includes the school resource officers, that includes the gun violence reduction team, that includes the, what's the other one I'm forgetting? Thank you, the transit function. And I committed to us evaluating not only those 3 units, but all of the specialty units. We have many, many specialty units that not only address those issues, we also have narcotics, child sex trafficking, domestic violence. There's a number of units, and I agree with Commissioner Hardesty that we should review everything and that we should be honest and transparent about whether these units are effective, how they're operating, and what we need to do going forward.
So you guys are still, oh, sorry.
And I think we're missing the bigger point. Commissioner Hardesty is one of the first, not the first, but one of the first people of color to serve on the Portland City Council. And her voice is extremely important to me, particularly during this time when we are putting the Black community front and center and first and foremost in terms of our actions going forward. And so she has been a tremendously important ally to me as we go through this and think about the right steps together. But she's not exclusively the only person or the only leader that I'm speaking with. I'm actually speaking with many, many people with very different perspectives throughout the Black community as we go through this process.
So are you guys still planning the review of those specialty units for
Yes,
February?
that's still on the table. Obviously, we will not be reviewing the school resource officer program. I have made that decision. I have had the opportunity now to direct that action as the Commissioner of Police here in the city of Portland. But I do believe we should review those other units as well, and I already committed to it in the budget.
Got it. Last question, changing track slightly, but 2 commissioners have now called for a ban on tear gas, and I'm curious where you stand on that.
I'm going to let Chief Davis answer the question about tear gas.
Okay.
Is there anything else for me before I have him answer that question?
Yeah, we'll bring Chief Davis up here in just a moment. We have a couple more questions via text and email for the mayor. One is just clarification for what you did speak about earlier, but the question from the Portland Mercury is, was it your decision or Superintendent Guerrero's decision to pull SROs from schools?
I made this decision yesterday. We began putting the wheels in motion. I informed the police chief yesterday that this was a decision I had made. I informed Commissioner Hardesty last night that this was a decision I had made. And there was part of me that wanted to run that out yesterday, but I couldn't do it. And the reason I couldn't do it is I felt a professional and personal and frankly a moral obligation to meet with the Youth Services Division folks and the school resource officers face-to-face, virtually, but face-to-face. I wanted them to hear the decision from me directly, why I had made the decision, and give them an opportunity to reflect on the decision I had made. I did not want them to hear about this in the news media. So we made that decision. Superintendent Guerrero and the school board made their decision independently. But what it shows, I would describe the Portland Public School Superintendent's call for a severing of the ties with the school resource officer program as further proof that this is a community demand.
One last question from Lisa at Coin TV. I understand you don't hire the police command staff, but as commissioner, are you concerned there are no people of color in the command staff, and will you work with the chief to change that anytime soon?
I strongly support diversity, and I believe one of the most important things that we can do to improve the relationship between communities of color, particularly the Black community, in our police bureau is making sure there are more people who are hired and retained within the bureau who represent the broader diversity of the community. And anybody who knows me knows that I have not been shy about that. I hired Portland's first Black female police chief, Danielle Outlaw. People are aware that my first chief of staff was the first African-American male chief of staff to any mayor in the history of this entire city. Today, the majority of my leadership team are people of color, and it's important because you get different perspectives than your own. I represent the majority community. That's not a shock or a surprise to anybody. I'm of a different lived experience than the people who have been impacted by this systemic and institutional racism. And so having that diversity, I think, enhances our perspectives, gives us points of view. And the answer is yes, I would absolutely support working with the police chief and others to ensure that we continue to have those different perspectives, those different voices centered in our conversations about policing, along with everything else we do in this community.
Any other questions in-house for Mayor Wheeler?
Clarify question. You mentioned about $1 million. Did you, for a community group, did you say that that's coming out of PPP's budget?
So where it's coming from more specifically, the individuals who are currently involved in the SRO program, for example, they're not fired. They're not losing their jobs. I want to be really clear about that. We are redeploying them as patrol and in other areas throughout the organization, but they are not losing their jobs. Where we're going to get the resources is from some of the vacancy positions that currently exist within the Portland Police Bureau.
Okay, Mayor Wheeler, thank you. We'll bring Deputy Chief Chris
Thank you.
Davis to the microphone now to answer some questions, and we'll begin with the reporters that are here. Have any questions for Chief Davis?
And maybe while someone's getting ready to come up to the microphone, I can talk a little bit about tear gas. Tear gas actually is, that term is a little bit inaccurate regarding what we use. We use something called CS gas, which is a little bit different as I understand it, and we're going to stretch the limits of my understanding of these kinds of things. CS gas is actually a very fine powder, and we use it as opposed to what is traditionally known as tear gas because it is only used as an area denial technique, which means all you have to do if you are in a cloud of CS gas is walk out of it, and then you stop feeling the effects. You'll have a little bit of an aftertaste. I've experienced this myself because we expose our crowd control teams to it so that they understand what it is that they're about to use on people and how to counteract its effects. But as far as a ban on CS gas, what that would do for us is put us in the position of having to figure out a different way to accomplish that objective. I won't go into all of the details of our policies, but we have very specific policies about when CS gas use is authorized and how it is to be used. There are some specific steps that have to happen, like there has to be a direction for people to go. There have to be warnings in advance. We have means of making sure we're confident that people can hear the warnings that we've given. And then the whole idea of that tool is to just get people out of the area that they are occupying right now. And as you'll read in our policy, it requires a fairly significant level of violence from the crowd. That objective is a lot safer actually to accomplish with the use of something like CS than it would be if we weren't able to use that and we still needed to accomplish that objective because of threats to safety. The alternatives to CS are things that tend to be higher levels of force that we actually like to avoid.
All right, I do have a number of emailed questions for Chief Davis. First one from Pat at KGW. Can you briefly talk about the police liaison program, how it came to be, and what value you see in adding it to the efforts to deal with the large protests? And as a follow-up, is it working now?
For the follow-up question, yes, it is working. Actually, it works really well. The police liaison program is something that we've established in about the last 18 months or so. And the intent is for us to have liaison officers that are dressed different than police officers. They still need to be identified and identifiable as police officers, but we put them in a different uniform so they're really easily identifiable. And their job is to interact with any organizers or people in the crowd to the extent that those folks are willing to interact with them. And their goals are to try to find out what the objective is, if there are ways for us to facilitate the objectives of the protest group, and then to encourage organizers of protest events to help us separate out anyone who shows up wanting to use that environment as a place to commit criminal acts.
Okay. Follow-up question from KGW. Does PPB culture allow officers to report bad behavior by their fellow officers without the fear both of official and unofficial retribution?
PPB culture not only allows it, PPB culture encourages it, and as a chief's office, it's our expectation. And we have policies specific to this that require officers to report incidents of misconduct by other members. And you see this play out sometimes. You know, I saw some video the other day, and I don't know who the officers were, but there's an officer who was maybe starting to get a little heated, which they're human beings, and they do. And I saw another officer come over and just kind of take that officer by the elbow and just kind of say, hey, let's go over here a minute and let's recenter ourselves. So yes, we encourage that, and we don't tolerate any kind of retaliation against someone for stepping up. You know, just in the last couple of years, and I can't elaborate obviously on personnel matters, but I have seen more than one instance where we have needed to take fairly significant corrective action on employee misconduct that we wouldn't have known about had not another employee come forward and said they witnessed something that they didn't think was right. So we intend for that to be a cornerstone of our culture.
There's a CBS News story that came out, I think today, reporting that these well-coordinated groups had potentially compromised law enforcement radio communications in Portland over the weekend. Do you know anything about that, or could shine any light?
Well, obviously, I'm not going to talk about specific tactical things or anything like that, but I haven't seen any evidence of that in the last several days. And so, you know, you never know if a group intent on criminal activity is able to anticipate something that we're doing. We always have to ask ourselves how that happened and try to find out. We have pretty tight control because of the radio technology that we use. So if someone were to get a hold of one of our radios, it would be fairly useless to them fairly quickly because we can deactivate them remotely, as I understand it. But sometimes that happens just because they overhear something from an officer's radio that they're standing next to. So we really can't say that anybody's compromised our radio communications at this point.
So earlier in the week, sorry, Kelly from K2. Earlier in the week, we talked a lot about the National Guard coming in to help out. Mayor Wheeler said one of his big reasons for it was that officers are working long hours, people get tired. You even mentioned, sometimes tempers can flare when we are overtired. What are you guys doing for your police force, night in and night out, hours on end, they're out there working to kind of mitigate and make sure that they're getting the breaks that they need and the rest that they need so that they are clear of mind?
That is a great question, because we do need to take care of these people. They are human beings, and when we get tired, we start to make mistakes. We start to cut corners, and that's just human nature. As well trained as they are, I mean, I have to say our members are tired, and for them to have performed as well as they have, as consistently as they have, is just a testament to the quality of the individuals who work there. We have received a tremendous amount of support from other agency partners across the metro area and as far away as the Salem Police Department. And I have to give a lot of credit to the Oregon State Police, because they have made a significant effort to support us in all of this, with over 100 of their troopers drawn from all over the state. And these are people who have moved to Portland in some cases for a few days to help us with this. So that support has helped us to find opportunities to give folks downtime so that they can recover.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a number of questions from the Oregonian. They've asked me to ask of you, Chief. So the first one is, can police give any estimate of crowd size over the last week and whether it's grown on successive days?
Sure. Crowd size is, estimating crowd size is at least as much art as it is science. But what we have seen is the crowd sizes are gradually getting smaller, but they're still really big. So we were looking at crowds at the beginning of this in excess of 15,000. The night before last, I believe we estimated the peaceful crowd of protesters in the square at about 10,000 people. Last night's protest crowd, and again, I want to be clear to draw a distinction between protesters, which are fine, and which are not, there's nothing wrong with, and then some people who try to use the protest as an opportunity to commit crimes. But the protester estimate for last night was about 8,000 people.
Thank you for that. Second question. ProPublica reported today that widespread, and you addressed this a little bit earlier about tear gas, but the widespread, sometimes indiscriminate use of tear gas on American civilians in the midst of a respiratory pandemic threatens to worsen the coronavirus, along with racial disparities in its spread and who dies from it. Will PPB continue to use tear gas?
Well, we would like to never have to use CS gas again in the city. We've never wanted to use CS gas because for a whole lot of reasons. Number one, we don't like using force on people. And we also recognize the impact that that has in the broader community to see images of that. So we will gladly stop using CS gas as long as we can and still protect public safety. And we've been very careful in our efforts to make sure that if we have to use CS gas, people who aren't involved in illegal activity and who aren't part of the problem that has necessitated the use of that tool aren't impacted by it.
Thank you. Next question. There are some protesters whose goal it is to defund police and who are so deeply angry that they believe that violence or destruction is a tool for getting their message across. They don't believe in talking to police or that a dialogue can be productive and say there's no end in sight to their protesting. How does the city and how do police respond to this and work through this?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind there. One is when we say there are protesters who are intent on using violence, I don't believe that. There are protesters, and then there are people who are intent on using violence. And violence is contrary to all of our values as Portlanders, and I would like to think as Americans, but certainly in this community. And then to the point about dialogue, I've been a police officer for a pretty long time now, and I've been in some pretty tense and difficult situations, and I haven't been through very many of them that we weren't able to resolve through dialogue. So my encouragement to everyone would be, if anything, this is the time to engage in more dialogue, and we are certainly ready in our organization to engage in that with our community.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question. How is the city paying for the continued nightly police coverage of the protest? Is it all overtime costs?
No, it is not. There is a significant overtime cost associated with the activities of the last week right now, but we also have a lot of what we call straight time resources. So these are when people are scheduled to work anyway. We have adjusted shifts so that when we have people who are just working their regular shifts, we've deployed them as efficiently as we can to cover the needs from the protest activities and then the related events that we've seen. And then I saw a budget update this morning that says, at least for now, for the fiscal year that we are ending in about a month, we are still just inside our budget. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to keep it that way.
Sorry. Kelly from K2 again, acting as a liaison for everyone. You mentioned a little bit about how obviously these folks who are causing destruction, you're not calling them protesters, but have you noticed or have you guys been able to narrow down any groups that may have been involved in those violent acts over the last few days? And if so, where do you go from there with them?
So there's always a tendency to want to see an organized group. And certainly if that's what's going on, if there's an organized effort for something on this big of a scale, that will be pretty easy to figure out. But it's not always completely organized and centrally directed like we would think of in an organization. What we have done is we have done a lot of follow-up, and we've developed probable cause for a large number of individuals, and we continue to investigate the activities of the last week, and I anticipate a lot more efforts to identify and hold people accountable for those actions. We get a lot of help actually from our community in identifying people involved in criminal activity. So, you know, like I mentioned earlier, we were able to make some arrests last night based on probable cause from events earlier in the week, and I anticipate a lot more of that.
Thank you.
All right, sorry for the delay there. We just have a couple more questions for you, and then we'll have one more person come to the podium. So question from the Oregonian again. Portland Police Bureau said in its 4:42 a.m. news release today, at about 11:15 p.m., Portland Police Bureau's demonstration liaison officer spoke with some organization members and had a productive conversation. The demonstration remained peaceful for multiple hours. Can you elaborate? Who did the demonstration liaison officer speak to, and possibly what was discussed? Don't know if you have that information or not.
I don't have that information, and I was not privy to that conversation, so I don't
Okay.
have that information. All I know is exactly what you just said happened, and it was effective.
Last question from Coin TV, from Lisa. Between yourself and 4 assistant chiefs, including now E.C. Lee, there are no people of color. Is there a plan to change that?
There is a plan to change that, and there has been for a while. And, you know, I was listening to the question that was asked to the mayor earlier, and I have to walk a very fine line here, because one thing I would tell people is we have a captain's selection process going on right now with a fairly large number of people who have taken the test to become captains. And in our organization, captain and above is really the command staff. That group is already more diverse than it has been in the past, and I know every one of the people on that promotional list is probably hanging on every word right now for me to give some hints as to what's about to happen, but I would just say stand by. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Chief Davis. We have one more person who would like to share a statement with everyone out there. It is the chair of the board for the David Douglas School District, Andrea Valderrama. Will you please come up and take the microphone and share your statement?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone. I'm a little shorter than everyone. My name is Andrea Valderrama. I currently serve as the chair of the David Douglas School District in Outer East Portland. The United States was founded with a history of anti-Black racism and white supremacy embedded in multiple institutions and systems such as public safety, education, and housing, which have contributed to the murders of Black individuals like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Patrick Kimmons, Terrell Johnson, Quanice Hayes, and many others. The mission of the David Douglas School District is to provide meaningful, equitable, and highly effective instruction so that each student grows and thrives socially, emotionally, and academically. David Douglas School District's core values include diversity, equity, and safety. I unequivocally affirm that Black Lives Matter and that anti-Black racism and white supremacy must be dismantled at all levels of the David Douglas School District. I am also answering the call from the Minneapolis School District directing David Douglas School District and other districts to end any and all contracts with law enforcement agencies and disband in-district policing and security departments that place police officers in schools. In turn, I urge other school districts, and especially Portland Public Schools, Park Rose School District, Reynolds School District, and Centennial School District to take this same action. I'm bringing forward a resolution at our upcoming virtual school board meeting scheduled for June 11th, 2020 at 7 p.m. that will terminate the David Douglas School District's MOU with the PPB and any other law enforcement agency for the services of school resource officers or SROs. This resolution will direct the superintendent to take whatever action is necessary to terminate the contract. This resolution will also direct the superintendent to cease any further negotiations with PPB and any other law enforcement agency for event enforcement, training, and any other services. Lastly, it will direct the superintendent to disband in-district policing and security departments. Lastly, I urge the City of Portland to consider reinvesting these resources allocated for SROs for retention efforts for staff of color in the David Douglas School District and other school districts, and support alternative practices like restorative justice in our districts. We know that we have significant budget shortfalls, and additional resources in staff support and restorative justice and alternative services would be greatly appreciated. I really appreciate the time and your leadership, Mayor, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Chair Valderrama. If there are no other questions, we'll wrap this press conference up today. I want to thank everybody who joined us here today and everybody who joined us online. Thank you.